Since a 37-year-old mother of two was found murdered in her La Jolla home. And tonight, investigators say
that a suspect has been identified using DNA evidence and genealogical databases. News 8's Chris Groh is live at police headquarters with why this break in the case is bittersweet.
A DNA report lands on a detective's desk. One name. A name the family had known for 31 years. She was 16. She worked a night shift and came home to sleep in her own bed, in her own house, surrounded by her own family. By morning, she was gone. For 3 decades, Kansas City police had nothing. No suspect, no answer. Just a case file that grew heavier every year it sat untouched. Then, in November 2020, a laboratory test did something no detective, no witness, and no confession ever could. It named her killer. And when investigators read that name out loud, it wasn't a stranger. It wasn't someone who had slipped into the neighborhood and vanished into the night. It was someone who had sat at her family's table. Someone who had already been dead for 14 years. How do you arrest a killer who's already gone? And how did nobody see this coming for 31 years? Stay with me. This is the story of Fawn Cox. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me what country you're watching from tonight. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe, because this channel exists to make sure cases like this one are never forgotten.
Yeah, Carlo, Barbara Lee, police said originally that Barbara Becker died of sharp force injuries, but they believe there was always evidence that she fought off her attacker. That's because there was a trail of blood leading away from the La Jolla home. Turns out that trail of blood proved to be vital in finding her attacker.
Kansas City, Missouri, summer of 1989. Fawn Cox was 16 years old, the kind of teenager who did what was asked of her without complaint. She worked at Worlds of Fun, the local amusement park, taking shifts that often ran late into the night. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was hers, and by every account, she showed up for it. She lived with her parents and her younger sister, Felisa, in a modest home near 9th and Van Brunt Boulevard. It was the kind of household where the windows stayed open in the summer heat, where box fans and air conditioner units hummed through the night, and where a teenager coming home late from a shift was simply part of the family rhythm. On the night of July 26, 1989, that rhythm looked exactly like every other night before it. Fawn clocked out of Worlds of Fun around 11 o'clock. She didn't stop anywhere. She didn't linger. She came straight home because she had another shift waiting for her the next day. She went to her room. She went to bed. There was nothing that night to suggest this would be any different from the 100 nights before it. But somewhere in that house, while the air conditioners droned on and a family slept just rooms away, something was about to happen that would define the next 31 years of their lives. And the person responsible wasn't a stranger lurking outside the neighborhood. He knew exactly which window to choose. Picture the house at night. Every window slightly cracked for airflow. The steady mechanical hum of air conditioning units drowning out the smaller sounds. Footsteps, breathing, the creak of old wood. Fawn's parents were asleep. Her younger sister, Felisa, was asleep. The family dog was in the house, too. And at some point that night, the dog grew restless, agitated, pacing. No one got up to check. The dog was pregnant. Restlessness seemed explainable. Ordinary. Nothing worth waking up for. That single decision, to not get up, to not check, would haunt this family for decades. Somewhere outside, in the dark, someone approached that house. Not randomly, not blindly. Someone who understood the layout, who knew which room belonged to Fawn, who knew which window would let him in and out without drawing attention. He climbed. He broke through her window. Inside that small bedroom, in the space of what investigators would later estimate as a short, brutal window of time, Fawn Cox was sexually assaulted and strangled, and the house kept humming. The air conditioners kept running. The family kept sleeping, unaware that 30 feet away, their daughter's life was ending. No screams reached them. No sound broke through the mechanical white noise loud enough to wake anyone. Only the dog knew something was wrong, and the dog couldn't speak. By the time morning came, the man who did this was already gone, climbing back out the same window he'd entered, disappearing into a Kansas City summer, leaving behind no name, no face, no reason for anyone to suspect him. He would go on, living, working, existing within arm's reach of this grieving family for years to come. No one would ever hear that sound in the same way. Again, an alarm clock ringing and ringing and ringing, with no hand reaching out to stop it. Because that sound is what would break the silence just hours later. Morning arrived the way it always did, except for one detail. Fawn's alarm clock was still ringing. It didn't stop. It didn't get silenced by a groggy hand reaching over to hit snooze. It just kept going, minute after minute, an insistent, mechanical sound that eventually pulled her mother and her sister toward her bedroom door. They pushed it open, expecting to find her irritated, oversleeping, maybe annoyed at being woken up. Instead, they found her unresponsive in her bed. Felisa would later describe going over and shaking her and trying to wake her up, the way you'd wake up anyone running late for a shift. "Come on, get up." But Fawn wasn't getting up. She hadn't been breathing for hours. In an instant, an ordinary Kansas City morning became the first hour of a nightmare that would stretch across 3 decades. Police were called. The house that had been so quiet the night before was suddenly filled with officers. Questions, and a family struggling to process what had happened just rooms away from where they slept. The investigation into the murder of 16-year-old Fawn Cox had begun. No one in that house, or in that department, could have imagined it would take 31 years to get an answer.
March 21st, 1979, 37-year-old wife and mother Barbara Becker was ruthlessly murdered inside of this La Jolla home. The attack would go on to perplex San Diegans and investigators for years.
Now, jump forward. Kansas City, 2020. Inside the Kansas City Police Department's cold case section, a file exists that some detectives know by heart, even ones who weren't born when the crime happened. Fawn Cox's case had become one of those cases. The kind that gets passed down between generations of investigators, discussed in hallway conversations, revisited every time new technology promises a breakthrough. Captain Ben Caldwell, who had supervised the missing persons and cold case section, would later describe it simply, "This case touched people." It rattled the officers who worked it. Decades passed, and it still sat there, unsolved, unresolved, unforgotten. What do you do with a case that refuses to disappear, but offers no new evidence? You wait, you keep the file. You keep hoping science catches up to the mystery. In the summer of 2020, something changed. A federal initiative called Operation Legion brought new resources into Kansas City. Resources aimed specifically at solving violent crimes that had stalled for lack of funding or technology. For the first time in 31 years, the Fawn Cox case had a real chance. Rewind again, back to 1989, in the immediate aftermath of the murder. Investigators moved quickly, the way any department would with a case this disturbing. A young girl killed in her own bed, in her own home, while her family slept nearby. The community was rattled. People wanted answers immediately. Early on, police charged 2 teenage suspects. For a moment, it looked as though this case might be solved within weeks of the crime. A swift resolution to a horrifying event. Families braced for a trial. Neighbors speculated. The community, desperate for closure, wanted to believe justice was close, but the case built against those 2 teenagers began to unravel. The key witness, the person whose account had helped bring the charges in the first place, eventually admitted to being untruthful. The story didn't hold up under scrutiny. The charges were dropped. 2 teenagers walked free from a case that could have wrongly defined the rest of their lives. And Kansas City was left exactly where it started. No suspect, no answers, and a community shaken by how close they'd come to convicting the wrong people. For investigators, this wasn't just a dead end, it was a warning. A reminder of how fragile early leads can be, and how easily an investigation can chase the wrong shadow while the real one stays hidden in plain sight.
For years.
Does the lack of a motive make it difficult for you?
I think it goes without saying that it's going to compound some of our problems, to be sure.
Somewhere in Kansas City, the person actually responsible for Fawn's death continued living his life, unquestioned, unsuspected. He would remain that way for 17 more years, until his own death. In 2006, unknowingly left behind the one piece of evidence that would eventually expose him. Between 1989 and 2020, an entire generation grew up in Kansas City, not knowing who killed Fawn Cox. Technology changed. DNA science advanced from theory to courtroom-defining tool. Cold case units across the country began cracking decades-old mysteries using techniques that didn't exist when Fawn died. But for years, this particular case remained just out of reach. The tools weren't yet developed to make sense of the genetic material collected from the crime scene all those years earlier. For Fawn's family, this silence wasn't abstract. It was lived year after year. Birthdays passed. Holidays passed. Fawn's parents grew older, still carrying a question that never got answered. Felisa grew into adulthood carrying the memory of a sister frozen at 16. The family didn't get closure. They got waiting. They got detectives who occasionally called with updates that amounted to nothing new. They got a case file that technically remained open, but functionally sat still. This is the part of cold cases that rarely gets talked about. Not the crime itself, but the decades in between. The slow erosion of hope, the quiet, grinding endurance of families who have to keep living normal lives while an unanswered question sits underneath everything. Fawn's case wasn't unique in this, but it was about to become one of the rare ones that finally got its answer. Not through a lucky tip, not through a deathbed confession, but through a laboratory.
But 4 decades later, thanks to modern DNA testing, detectives were finally able to say that Paul Jean Chartrand was the man that killed Becker back in 1979. With the help of the FBI, police were able to compare DNA from blood collected at the original scene to DNA in public genealogical databases like 23andMe or Ancestry.com.
Here's where the story takes a turn that no one in 1989 could have anticipated. Somewhere in the extended Cox family was a cousin, Donald Cox Jr., roughly 5 years older than Fawn. Family gatherings, holidays, the ordinary web of relatives that exists in every extended family. He was never treated as a suspect, not in the initial investigation, not in the years that followed. There was no reason to look at him, no red flag, no prior incident on record that connected him to the crime. But investigators would later point to one small detail that, in hindsight, mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Whoever broke into that house knew exactly which window to choose. Sergeant Ben Caldwell would later put it plainly. Picking that home and that specific window to enter and exit undetected only made sense if the person already knew Fawn, knew the house, knew the family. Donald Cox Jr. fit that description perfectly. And nobody thought to look at him. He continued living his life for the next 17 years, existing on the periphery of a family still mourning a murder he was responsible for. He would have heard about the investigation. He may have offered condolences. He may have sat across from Fawn's parents at some point in some room at some family function, all while holding the answer they were desperate for. In 2006, Donald Cox Jr. died, a death investigated by the medical examiner at the time, under circumstances that raised enough questions to warrant a closer look. That inquiry would later be ruled not the result of foul play, but in the process, something happened that no one could have predicted would matter 14 years later. The medical examiner's office retained a blood sample from his case file. It sat there, untouched, waiting. Now, we return to 2020, to the moment everything changed. With Operation Legend's federal funding behind them, Kansas City Police Department finally had the resources to attempt something they couldn't afford on their own. Advanced genetic genealogy testing, the same category of forensic science that had cracked open the Golden State Killer case just 2 years earlier, in 2018. Here's how it works in plain terms. Traditional DNA testing looks for an exact match, comparing crime scene evidence directly against a known suspect's profile. But if the actual killer was never in a database, that method hits a wall. Genetic genealogy works differently. Instead of searching for an exact match, it searches for relatives. It builds out family trees using DNA markers, connecting distant cousins, second cousins, even more removed relations, slowly narrowing a massive pool of possibilities down to a specific family, and eventually a specific individual. For 31 years, the biological evidence recovered from Fawn's crime scene in 1989 sat waiting for technology to catch up to it. And in 2020, it finally did. Investigators submitted the crime scene DNA profile for advanced testing. And once the process began, answers came faster than anyone expected. Not years, not more decades, but a matter of weeks. The genetic genealogy results pointed toward a specific family line, the Cox family. Imagine being the detective staring at that result. 31 years of dead ends, false starts, and a community that had almost given up. And suddenly, the answer isn't a stranger from outside the neighborhood at all. It's someone who shares the victim's own last name. Investigators narrowed the pool further, cross-referencing the genetic matches with what they already knew about the case, including that critical detail about the killer needing intimate knowledge of the house and Fawn's bedroom window. One name kept surfacing, Donald Cox Jr., the same cousin who had died in 2006. The same man no one had ever suspected. The same person who had spent nearly 2 decades walking free, attending family gatherings, existing in the same orbit as the people mourning the girl he killed. But a genetic genealogy match alone wasn't enough. Investigators needed direct confirmation, a way to compare his actual DNA to the evidence collected in 1989. And that's when they remembered something extraordinary. 14 years earlier, when Donald Cox Jr. died in 2006, the medical examiner's office had investigated his death, a standard procedure given the suspicious nature of the circumstances at the time. As part of that investigation, they retained a blood sample. That death was ultimately ruled not the result of foul play. The file was closed. The sample was stored. No one connected it to Fawn Cox's murder. No one had any reason to. At the time, there was no DNA profile pointing back toward the Cox family. There was no genetic genealogy technology capable of drawing that line.
And they compare an enormous amount of DNA targets.
Dr. Monty Miller is a career forensic scientist and former crime scene investigator.
In these public databases that allow us to look at those and explore not only looking for the individual person, but any member of their family that may be close enough.
The sample simply sat in storage, an unremarkable piece of a closed, unrelated file, until 2020. Once genetic genealogy pointed investigators toward Donald Cox Jr., crime lab staff went looking for a way to confirm it directly. And they found it, sitting exactly where it had been left 14 years earlier. They extracted DNA from that retained blood sample and compared it against the DNA profile recovered from the bodily fluid. Found at Fawn's crime scene back in 1989. It was a match. Sit with that for a moment. The proof needed to solve a 31-year-old murder had been sitting in a medical examiner's storage for 14 of those years, collected during an entirely unrelated case, filed away, forgotten, waiting for someone to know what question to ask it.
Miller says Becker's case might have never been solved without the databases. Until now, detectives would have had to compare DNA evidence to a database full of only criminals, and that wasn't fully operational until 1996. While Chartrand was arrested in 1994, he died in Arizona in 1995.
If Donald Cox Jr. hadn't died the way he did in 2006, under circumstances just suspicious enough to warrant that blood sample being kept, this case might still be unsolved. Today, sometimes the answer to one mystery is hiding inside the file of a completely different one. For Kansas City Police, this wasn't just a break in the case. It was the department's first homicide ever solved using advanced genetic genealogy, a method that would go on to reshape how cold cases are approached nationwide. But for one family, the science wasn't the story. The name was November 10th, 2020. After 31 years of silence, detectives sat down with Fawn Cox's family to deliver the news they had waited 3 decades to hear. Both of Fawn's parents were still alive, still together, still carrying the weight of a question that had followed them since 1989. Felisa, Fawn's younger sister, the one who had shaken her awake that morning, the one who had lived every year since, as the surviving daughter, sat across from investigators as they finally said the name, Donald Cox Jr., their cousin. The reaction wasn't shock in the way you might expect. According to Captain Caldwell, the family was sad, but relieved. And there was something else, something almost harder to say out loud. They admitted they had sometimes wondered about him. Some quiet, unspoken suspicion that had never had anywhere to go because there was never any proof. Just a feeling, buried under 31 years of not knowing. Now they had proof. And it confirmed the very thing some part of them had feared all along. Felisa spoke to reporters afterward, describing what closure actually feels like after 3 decades of waiting for it. It's a relief, she said. There's finally an answer. But the answers, she added, aren't always the ones you were hoping for, because knowing who did this didn't undo what happened. It didn't give Fawn back the life that was taken from her at 16. It simply replaced an unbearable unknown with an unbearable truth. That the person responsible had been family. Someone who had been present, welcomed, trusted for years after the murder, while everyone around him had no idea. So who was the man behind this? Donald Cox Jr. was Fawn's cousin, roughly 5 years older than her. Beyond his family connection and his proximity to the household, very little about his life, character, or motive has been made public. Investigators have not disclosed a confirmed reason why he targeted Fawn that night. The motive remains officially unknown. What we do know is this. He had the kind of familiarity with the house that let him choose the exact right window, enter without detection, and leave the same way, undetected. While a family slept just feet away, he was never arrested. He was never charged. He was never tried in a courtroom, never forced to sit across from a jury, never made to answer for what he did. because by the time his name surfaced, he had already been gone for 14 years, dead since 2006, from what authorities have described as a drug overdose, following a death investigation that, ironically, was what preserved the evidence needed to finally expose him. There will be no trial, no sentencing, no moment where Fawn's family gets to watch him held accountable in a courtroom. What do you do with a killer who's already gone? For Kansas City, the answer wasn't punishment. It was simply the truth, arriving 3 decades too late to deliver justice, but not too late to deliver an answer. Beyond one family's private grief, this case carries a much larger significance.
While it
This
took
was the
decades
first
for Becker's
homicide
family to
ever
receive
solved by the
closure,
Kansas City
Miller
police.
believes these public
Department using
databases
advanced
could help
genetic
solve
genealogy
future cases,
placing it
before
alongside
they
a
go
small
cold.
but growing list of decades-old cases cracked open by the same category of science that identified the golden state killer in California just 2 years earlier, Captain Caldwell would later note something important for other departments watching cases like this one. Not every unsolved case is automatically a good candidate for genetic genealogy testing. It depends on the evidence available, the biological material preserved, and critically, promo funding, since this kind of advanced testing remains expensive. Without Operation Legion's federal support in 2020, Kansas City may not have been able to afford it at all. But when the conditions align, this technology has proven it can do something traditional. Investigation alone often cannot. Reach backward across 31 years and pull out an answer that had been sitting unreachable the entire time. For cold case units across the country, Fawn Cox's case became a proof of concept, a demonstration that even the most stubbornly unsolved cases might still have a path forward, waiting on the right combination of preserved evidence and evolving science. 31 years is a long time to wait for an answer. Long enough for a 16-year-old victim's parents to become grandparents, to grow old carrying a wound that never fully closed. Long enough for a baby sister to become a woman who has spent more of her life without Fawn than she ever spent with her. Long enough for an entire police department to pass a case file down through generations of detectives, each one hoping to be the one who finally cracked it. And when the answer came, it wasn't from a witness finally coming forward or a suspect confessing on his deathbed. It came from a laboratory, from strands of genetic material that had waited patiently in evidence storage and in a medical examiner's file, for science to learn how to read them. The person responsible was never a stranger lurking outside this family's life. He was inside it, present at gatherings, known by name, trusted enough to never be questioned. That's perhaps the most unsettling part of this case, and maybe the most important lesson buried inside it. The person you'd least expect isn't always a stranger. Sometimes they're already sitting at the table. Fawn Cox never got to grow up. Her family never got to watch her become an adult. But after 31 years, they got something they had almost stopped believing was possible. They got her name spoken as a victim, and her killer's name finally, permanently attached to the truth. If this case moved you, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments which cold case we should cover next. Every cold case has a file, but not every file has a name attached to the people who refuse to close it. Inside the Kansas City Police Department, the Fawn Cox case wasn't just a stack of papers sitting in a records room, gathering dust between other unsolved homicides. It became something closer to an inheritance, passed from one generation of detectives to the next, each one picking it up, reading through the same statements, staring at the same crime scene photographs, and eventually setting it back down with the same unanswered question. Who did this? For the officers who worked the original 1989 investigation, the case never fully left them. Some carried it into retirement. Some talked about it at dinner tables, unable to fully explain to their own families why one file, out of hundreds worked over a career, stayed lodged in memory the way this one did. There's a particular kind of weight that comes from investigating the murder of a 16-year-old girl killed in her own bed. A case with no stranger, no forced entry through a door, no easy explanation. Just a window of family sleeping nearby, and a killer who vanished into the dark without leaving anything behind that 1989 technology could use. Captain Ben Caldwell, who would later oversee the missing persons and cold case section, inherited this file the way so many detectives before him had. He didn't work the original case. He wasn't there in 1989, but he understood, the way anyone in that unit eventually understands, that some cases don't behave like cases. They behave like unfinished conversations. You keep circling back, hoping the next read-through reveals something everyone before you missed. For years, it didn't. Detectives would periodically reopen the file, cross-reference it against new suspects surfacing in other investigations, run whatever updated forensic techniques became available, and come away with nothing new. It's a particular kind of frustration that doesn't get discussed often in true crime storytelling. Not the dramatic chase, not the interrogation room breakthrough, but the quiet, repetitive discipline of checking a box that keeps coming back empty, year after year. Technology upgrade after technology upgrade. Still nothing. Caldwell would later describe the emotional toll this case took on the people who worked it. Not just the original detectives in 1989, but everyone who touched it in the decades since. This one touched a lot of people, he said, because she was an innocent child who was murdered in her own bed. It wasn't a case that faded into background noise the way some cold files do. It rattled the people who worked it. It stayed with them. There's a reason for that. Something about the intimacy of this crime. A victim killed inside the presumed safety of her own home, her own bedroom, with her family close enough to have heard something, if only the air conditioners hadn't been running that night, made the case feel less like a statistic and more like a personal failure every time it went another year without resolution. Meanwhile, outside the department, the Cox family lived with a different kind of weight. Every phone call from a detective carried both hope and dread. Hope that this might finally be the call with an answer. Dread that it would be another dead end, another apology. Another reminder that some parts of this story might never be answered. Fawn's parents grew older. Her sister Felisa built a life of her own, but the absence never fully receded into the background. There's a particular kind of grief that doesn't get easier with time so much as it gets folded into daily life. A permanent presence rather than a passing wave. And through it all, the file stayed open. Somewhere in a records room in Kansas City, a box of evidence collected in July of 1989 sat waiting. A DNA profile, recovered from bodily fluid at the scene, sat in storage long before anyone knew how to fully use it. It wasn't useless. It was simply ahead of its time.
Still, not much is known about Chartrand's motive. Police did not mention it when they announced that they believed that he was the murderer.
Evidence collected by investigators who had no way of knowing that, one day, the science would finally catch up to what they'd preserved. This is often the untold part of cold case stories, the years of maintenance, the unglamorous work of keeping evidence intact, keeping files organized, keeping a case technically open, even when there's no active lead to chase. It requires a kind of institutional patience that doesn't make for dramatic television, but without it, breakthroughs decades later simply wouldn't be possible. By the time Operation Legion brought federal funding into Kansas City in the summer of 2020, the case had already survived 3 decades of near misses, false starts, and quiet persistence. It had outlived some of the original detectives' careers. It had outlived old theories, discarded suspects, and years of institutional turnover. What it hadn't outlived was the evidence itself, carefully preserved. Waiting for a moment nobody in 1989 could have predicted. That moment was about to arrive, and when it did, it would move faster than anyone inside that department had dared to hope.